Hello, hello.
Okay, I listen to you. I hear you.
Okay, so the sound is going through the mixer or not?
Yeah, I got the interval, but normally it should not go to the mixer. It should go to the speaker.
Okay.
But it's okay. It's okay for the recording.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? It's a new. It's good. Okay. It's so great to see you. I'm here to bid you welcome, and I want to say a few words, but I won't take too long. I hope we'll have a very interesting conversation. The transatlantic relationship has been at the heart of the international rules-based order since 1945. It has had its ups and downs, I think we can say, but really it has been having these joint values all the time and the rule-based approach, and it still has. So when I was skimming through the AmCham EU 2024 Transatlantic Economy report, we can see the continued relevance of this relationship. Creates 16 million jobs across both sides of the Atlantic. No place in the world has attracted more US foreign direct investments than Europe. Over the past decade, Europe has attracted over 55% of the total US global investments. And Europe has accounted for 62% of the foreign capital invested in the US as of 2022. As the panel will explore in just a minute, this year is filled with the potential twists and turns in the transatlantic relationship. The largest, which is, of course, the elections, both in Europe and in the US. We saw the first half of that unfold last week here in Europe. And the rise of the far right is concerning. It's troubling, particularly if mirrored by in the council in the future national elections. We could see an erosion of the commitments to climate, migration measures, and support to Ukraine, amongst other topics. But now we wait for the American elections, and no matter the outcome, our hope is that we see less protectionism and no trade restrictions on both sides of the Atlantic. Microsoft is a company with proud transatlantic legacy, and we are very invested on both sides of the Atlantic to see competition, innovation, and a relationship based on the same values. We know how impactful the transatlantic collaboration can be in forging norms, legal solutions, systems of collaboration. We've seen the Trade and Technology Council push forward new ways of cooperation. We keep seeing progress on the EU-US data privacy framework, fingers crossed, and expanding towards more global forum. The G7 has been leading on AI regulatory innovation. Regardless of what happens in November, for Microsoft, it's crucial that the cooperation between the US and Europe continues to drive towards mutually beneficial goals of innovation, growth, and prosperity. And upholding the multilateral rules-based international order that creates stability and predictability. So this brings me to the panel we have today with the College of Europe, where their chair of Transatlantic Trade and Economy, Dan Jan Lesser, will lead the conversation, exploring how the transatlantic relationship will respond to the year of elections and change alongside several esteemed panelists. And I want to finish with a special welcome to any of College of Europe students on the first row. Who, I believe that College of Europe is one of the best incubators of young talents here in Europe. I have several alumnus in my team, and I'm really looking forward to also hearing some of your ideas. So welcome everyone again, and looking forward to the panel.
Thank you. Nana Louis, thank you very, very, very much for the introduction. And thanks to Microsoft for hosting us here. And thanks to all of you for joining us. You know, it is, we had this idea of trying to bring together from around town before we break for the summer, young leaders, if I can say, with an interest in transatlantic relations. And also, it's in the context of the chair that I hold at the College of Europe, but that it too is in a way joint with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston. And I know some of you are going off to Fletcher shortly. I went there many years ago, among other places. And so I feel, you know, many connections to this conversation, but huge thanks to all of you for joining us. When we were thinking of the title, Year of Decision, you know, there's a tendency to think about elections. And of course, it is about elections. But it's not just about elections. It's also about policy choices and other things. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about that here and also with our online audience. But we have three really wonderful people with us to talk about this from different perspectives. And if I can just introduce them to you briefly, starting on my far left, although not politically, probably. We don't know these things. Dan Michaels, Brussels Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal, and then Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe here in Brussels. And online, we're very grateful to have with us Charles Kupchan, who is at Georgetown University, but also at the Council on Foreign Relations. Charlie, thank you very much for joining us. I thought maybe we would start out this way, maybe with Rosa. You know, sitting here in Brussels, I don't need to tell you all the political things that have been happening recently and are set to happen. But let's put that a little bit in transatlantic context as well. I mean, you're a very keen observer of all of this. Maybe to say a little bit about how you read it and what it might mean for the transatlantic relationship, which is so critical, as Nana Louis has started to talk to us about. Rosa, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see so many young people in the audience. That's something that's very nice for us. How do things look like? I mean, obviously, we've just had the elections in the for the European Parliament. We are about to start a few weeks, maybe not. Maybe it'll be quite a brief period of time in which the new leadership will be decided at the EU level. Perhaps even we might even know tomorrow the outcome, at least the preferences of the heads of states and governments meeting informally this evening. And then we have the US elections in November. So it is a little bit of a transition period. What we know is that the past 4 years, we've seen a return of the transatlantic relationship. We've seen warming of relations across the Atlantic. We've seen the US administration doubling down on the concept of allies, and EU institutions and countries are responding very positively to this. So there's been a new dynamic, for sure. Will this continue? I mean, I'm afraid, I think the uncertainty and the pull towards divergence is actually very strong. This comes out of the European Parliament elections. As you said, as was said earlier, 25% of the vote went for radical right parties. And it's not that radical right parties are necessarily anti-transatlanticists. In fact, some are openly Atlanticist, strongly Atlanticist, but they are less inclined towards cooperation generally, international cooperation generally. So there will be factors in the political equation in Europe that will be working against a continuation of the deepening of the transatlantic relationship. Then, of course, we'll have the same happening in the United States in case of Trump victory in the elections. So I think there's this. The other thing I think to take into account is the commonality of themes that we're seeing. We're seeing polarizing politics in the US, and we're seeing them across Europe. We're seeing complaints about cost of living crisis. We're seeing that in both in Europe, and that's not just the EU, that's Europe more generally, and in the United States. We're seeing publics sharing discontent about the way in which the economy is led both in the US and in Europe, even though the economies are actually doing quite differently. So, I mean, the US is doing far better and is recovering from COVID far better than Europe is. So we're seeing a commonality of themes, but the commonality of themes is driving perhaps politics in disparate directions rather than bringing politics closer. So what's going to happen will depend a little bit on the outcome of leadership and the next European Commission, and very much on the elections in the United States, whether the transatlantic relationship is going to be further strengthened and continue on what has been laid out over the past few years, or whether we're going to see it being pulled in different directions.
Rosa, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these things. But before I move on to Charlie, I wanted to ask you, I was very struck today. I was reading a piece, might have been in the Wall Street Journal, I'm not sure. Anyway, that mentioned the fact that neither Macron nor Biden are getting credit from their publics for having managed the economy sort of reasonably well. Okay, granted, better on the other side of the Atlantic, but not bad. Inflation down, unemployment down, and the public doesn't seem to care.
Yes, the public doesn't seem to care. Well, I mean, this is a big question. I'm not entirely sure I have the answer, but I think we're seeing political dynamics that are driven by a number of factors, such as identity politics, such as conspiracy theories. The business model of the media has been challenged in such a way that it's very hard to get fact-based evidence closer to the electorate. If you look at empirical research, for instance, trying to understand who's voting for the radical right, this is an area that I follow, so I've looked into this a little bit more. It's the youth vote. Young people are voting, especially men, and the social media they're engaging with are bubbles. Then they are sticking to their media bubbles. So it's very hard to pierce those bubbles and get different messages across. And then I think this is symptomatic of a general distrust in politics that we're seeing across the board. Again, I think in the transatlantic dimension. And so economic performance is less important.
Right. Charlie, just want to bring you in. You're in Washington, although we see each other more on this side of the Atlantic these days. Let me ask you a little bit about the mood in D.C., and specifically how you read the kinds of things that Rosa was just talking about when translated into the American scene. And maybe even, if you like, a word about the burden-sharing piece as it's figured in the campaigns. But Charlie, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us online.
Sure. Good to be with you, Ian. Nice to see everyone. I think that there's a kind of almost schizophrenia in the transatlantic community, in the sense that on the one hand, there really is an enormous sense of unity, of solidarity, of common purpose, arguably to a degree that we haven't seen since the Cold War. Maybe it goes beyond the Cold War. And I think it goes beyond the Cold War in part because Europeans feel an existential threat as a consequence of the war in Ukraine in a way that they didn't during the Cold War, when, yes, there was an existential threat, but bombs were not dropping right on the EU's eastern frontier. And as a consequence, I do think that there's an urgency that has pushed the two sides of the Atlantic together in a very tangible way. And I would point out that Europe is in some ways ahead of the United States, and that's a flip of the script. It's Europe that has been pushing the United States on tanks, on ATACMS, on F-16s, on using American weaponry to hit targets in Russia proper. And so this is kind of very different than the previous situation. Now, you mentioned burden sharing, and there, I would say the glass is more half full than it is half empty, in the sense that you have seen very significant increases in European defense spending. I think about half or more of NATO members are going to be meeting the 2% benchmark. Does that mean that we're suddenly seeing the emergence of a strong European pillar, that Europe could carry out major operations without the United States? No, we are not there yet. But I think in many respects, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reanimated the US commitment to Europe, and the troops that have been deployed in Europe from the United States are probably going to be there for a very long time, because regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, I think there will be a sense of a continuing, ongoing, rather imminent threat of Europe, of Russia to NATO territory. So that's kind of the sort of the good news story. And then at the very same time, there's an enormous amount of anxiety here in Washington. I just saw you, Ian, in Stockholm, on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it stems primarily from the deep-seated uncertainty about where our politics are going, and by the reality, in my sense, that the real most urgent threat to the West does not come from Vladimir Putin. It comes from the erosion of our political centers. It comes from the prospect of a liberal populism. It comes from the possible return of a Trump administration that turns upside down what we call the liberal rules-based order, because he doesn't really believe in it anymore. And we don't really know what to do about this, right? And we don't know whether the pendulum is going to swing in a positive or a negative direction, because on any given day, we get conflicting data points. On the one hand, Biden beats Trump. In the Polish election, the center returns. Lula beats Bolsonaro. Yes, the center held in the recent European Parliament election, and the Parliament will continue to be governed by, most likely, pro-EU parties that reside in the ideological center. But on the other hand, we got results in France that are very worrying. Had we been on this call 3 years ago, I would have said, thank God for Germany. The political centers in the US and the UK are eroding. Germany is hanging in there. I'm not sure we can say that anymore, given what we're seeing about the continuing rise of AfD and the damage that was done to the coalition parties in the recent European Parliament elections. And so there is really, I think, a deep-seated anxiety about what the hell is going on here and what can we do about it. And I think in the end of the day, this is a combination of what Rosa said, and that is conspiracy theory, social media, but it is also based on real-world problems. Here in the United States, it's hard to make ends meet. Somebody in the Midwest who used to work on a production line, they were earning $32, $33 an hour in today's dollars. Now they're working at Walmart or Amazon in the service economy, and they're making, I don't know if they're lucky, $14 an hour. It's hard to make ends meet on $14 an hour. And then we've got the immigration problem on both sides of the Atlantic. And at least here in the United States, we haven't been able to get any serious legislation on immigration through Congress since the Reagan presidency. And as a consequence, Biden just issued an executive order to shut down the southern border, but it may be overturned by the courts. And then I'll conclude, Ian, with the other thing that I think is keeping people up at night, and that is Ukraine, where I believe we have a policy, but we don't have a strategy. We have a policy, which is we're going to keep sending arms and money and support to Ukraine, and we pretend that they're going to win and effectively reclaim territory currently occupied by Russian forces. But I'm not sure there are a lot of people left who believe that that's actually going to happen. And as a consequence, I think we have to have a more open public conversation and conversation with the Ukrainians about where this war is going, what their war aims are, and how to come up with a strategy that matches war aims to available means. And given the numerical superiority of Russia, given the fact that Putin seems ready to play the long game, I think we probably have to redefine success here to focus on making sure that the 81% of Ukraine under Ukrainian control turns into a success story, turns into a stable, democratic, prosperous country, and begin to focus on that outcome, not giving up on Eastern Ukraine, but deferring the recovery of Ukrainian territory until we end up with a negotiated settlement, probably after Putin is long dead. But we're not having that conversation publicly, and I think it leaves us in a situation where what we say about Ukraine and what's happening on the ground in Ukraine are not one and the same. And it could be problematic as we head into the summer, not at all out of the question that Putin is waiting for a major offensive, looking for a major breakthrough at the very moment that NATO leaders are meeting in Washington at a summit. So these are risks, I think, that we need to keep an eye on as this summer unfolds.
Charlie, thank you very much. I mean, you gave us a lot to talk about here and underscored a number of the key debates that are going on, but also some that aren't going on. And, you know, before I move on to Dan, I just maybe wanted to come back and ask you whether you could comment on, you know, kind of whoever wins in November. There is this other problem of a kind of chaotic governance in the United States that Europe will confront in various issue areas, no matter what happens. Do you see any prospect of that changing?
Well, a Biden victory and a Trump victory lead to quite different outcomes. But I do think that if you're an American ally, whether it's South Korea or Japan or Germany or France, you have no choice but to wonder about the reliability of the United States as your partner and guarantor, simply because it's quite apparent that the United States is passing through a moment of political dysfunctionality that is going to be with us for quite some time. And it's important to keep in mind that even with Biden in the White House, and he's an Atlanticist, he's a multilateralist, he is ready to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We passed through a 7-month delay in the approval of aid, which has led to Ukrainian loss of territory, deaths on the battlefield. This is a real world consequence of the fact that in the United States we live in a very polarized world, and I see no prospect of that coming to an end anytime soon. And I do think that one of perhaps the mistakes that the Biden people made was underestimating the continuing appeal of an America First narrative. And I don't think it's going to dissipate. I think it's going to get stronger. My best guess is that the 61 billion package that just passed through Congress is probably the last package of that size that is going to get through Congress, regardless of the complexion of the House and the Senate that emerges after November. Those are realities that I think allies need to confront. And I think in the end of the day, it means that they will continue to adhere to the alliance, to bet on the United States as their best partner, but they're going to have no choice to hedge. And for Europe, in some ways, the choice is easy. You build up as much capability as you think you can, because if you do that, you have, number one, a better case for keeping the United States tethered to you as a good partner. And number two, if the United States does go down the rabbit hole, if the United States does move toward a more distant position when it comes to NATO, then Europe is better prepared to stand on its own 2 feet.
Charlie, thank you very much. Dan, I mean, of course, feel free to comment on any of the things that you heard, but I wanted to ask you in particular about kind of something that I see, and I don't know if you agree, that there is on both sides of the Atlantic, and in fact globally, this increasing pressure of economic nationalism, if I can put it that way. It goes by different names in different places, but it's got different components to it, not least on trade, but not just. And at the same time, as I think both Rosa and Charlie have underscored, there's these increasing demands for alliance cohesion across the Atlantic. How do these things fit together? It strikes me that they don't.
First of all, Ian, thank you, and thanks to everybody for having me here. I especially pleased to be on a transatlantic panel because, as you might guess from my accent, like you, I am transatlantic. And maybe let me sort of back into an answer to some of that. In reflecting on this, I left America in '91 to go to Poland and Russia to work in privatization. And I say this because it struck me that ever since then, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the economy has really been primary on so many issues in both the economy itself, but in politics. And what's particularly unusual now is that for the first time in probably 3 decades, it's not. You know, we have things like the war in Ukraine and real geopolitical tensions that, unlike a lot of the past ones, like the financial crisis, the Euro crisis, those were geopolitical, but they were inherently economic. And I mean, yes, I'm sure that in many of the conflicts we have now, there are economic reasons to it. I'm sure there's an economic interpretation of what Putin is doing, but shooting bullets is still very different from renegotiating debt. So we're looking at the world through a slightly different lens, but still so much of what we have to look at is exactly the kind of economic questions you're raising, because in many ways that's still what voters are thinking about, and that's what's driving a lot of the political shifts we're seeing, even if, yes, people are scared in a way they probably haven't been in decades of war. But if you think back on the more purely economic aspects of this, from, let's say, the early 90s, you had some moments that put things in place that we're living with now. One of them was Bill Clinton, a Democrat, pushed for China to join the WTO. Now, that was, kind of like Nixon, the Republican going to China. That was Nixon's going to China was the geopolitical crossing lines. Clinton with trade, going against traditional democratic policies, bringing China in, seemed like a master stroke at the time, and we're living in many ways with consequences of that now. You also had similarly an economic building block, the transformation of the European communities into the European Union, which created, the single market, this powerhouse of an economy that the constituent states would never be on their own. It's still a half-finished project, but we are living in the result of that now. And then you had this boom in the transatlantic economy, and we heard a bit about it in the introduction. And these numbers from AmCham EU, I actually checked that same report myself before coming here, and I want to.
We all do.
Some of the numbers in it are mind blowing. And one of the things that struck me is we hear a lot about transatlantic trade. Trump was very focused on the trade deficit and the balance of trade. Under the Biden administration, it's been the Trade and Technology Council. And it's easy to get fixated on trade because ships with containers are easy to see. But what's far more important is the value and the result of investment. And U.S. investment in Europe and European investment in the U.S. And the numbers are in last year, the trade in goods reached an all-time high of a bit over $1 trillion, okay? But if you look at the amount of investment on both sides, $7 trillion, okay? And that is, it's Microsoft here. It's Mondelez selling Oreos in Europe. It's IKEA selling furniture in the US. It's all of that. The two economies are so intertwined, and that means it pulls the two together. But in some ways, it also engenders conflicts that we've seen around the Inflation Reduction Act, and the questions over who wins, who loses. Can it be a win-win? I think the broader context for that, as we hear about the rules-based international order, the rules benefit us, the transatlantic community and a few other countries. They don't benefit a lot of other countries. And I think that is part of what's causing some of the international tensions now. And coming back to China and the WTO, didn't work out the way everybody hoped it would. And that comes to the issue, which I think is fundamental to elections on both sides of the Atlantic, which is economic resentment. Because the good economic growth in the US and in France is far from evenly spread. The Northeast France, strong Le Pen country, the upper Midwest, which is probably where the US election will be decided, people are not winning. They're not, buying multi-million-dollar houses, and they see other people getting rich. So it's a question of who is benefiting. And I think this comes back to it. On the aggregate, things are doing well, but if you look within that, you see huge variations, and that is fueling a lot of the conflict that we're seeing on both sides.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I just wanted to also give all of you a little bit of, and those online, a little bit of a roadmap, because we're going to continue our conversation a bit here, but then we're going to go to all of you. So please, get questions, comments, whatever you like, ready. But also online, if you like, you can use the Q&A function to submit a question, and I will see that. So please do. Dan, and others may want to comment on this as well. I mean, we have these disputes going over IRA, over other things, industrial policy, different approaches to climate and energy transition and all of these things. If we had the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, TTIP, which didn't happen, if we had it, would we have this in the same way today?
It's an interesting question. Old line I heard is, if we had ham, we could have ham and eggs. If we had eggs, that it was so theoretical when it was under discussion. And the reason it was even proposed was there were so many conflicts. There was like one side said, oh, we need to discuss this. And the other side said, well, if you want to discuss that, we have to discuss this. And everyone just kept piling on different things, which made it unwieldy and unworkable. So I think its very existence as a topic of discussion showed how difficult the subjects were. And so I think, realists now hope, or maybe cynics, hope that the way to approach this is to bite off little bits of it and find the places where agreement is possible. I mean, that was the idea behind the Trade and Technology Council, which kind of ring-fenced the future. Let's talk about things where there aren't vested interests. And plan for the future, like AI. There are questions about whether that's working even. But it is one of the fundamental problems with the transatlantic economy and the relationship is almost like a sibling rivalry that both sides want to get the most possible out of a relationship, where in many cases one side is going to do better. Now, it's not necessarily a win-lose, but it's greater benefit, less benefit. And the politicians on neither side want to be the one on the losing side. So I think, coming back to your question, I don't see how we're ever going to get something that smooths out the underlying problems.
I mean, even though, and Charlie, or Rosa, you might want to comment on this as well. I mean, even though, in a sense, the unstated, well, it was stated at the time, rationale for TTIP was really a kind of regulatory, but who was going to make the rules, and they're going to be China. It was a kind of strategic project about China, and arguably since that time, the relationship with China has gotten even more fraught. And concern about it has grown here too. But it didn't happen. I mean, Charlie, looking at this from Washington, or Rosa from Brussels, I mean, do you see any prospect of getting back to something like that with the United States? I mean, we talk about the centrality of the relationship as a norm setter and other things, but, where's the progress on this?
No, I don't. I also think that we're, in a phase in which the rules-based order is seriously challenged. It's challenged by actors that are not part of the West, but it's also challenged within our own societies. And so I don't really see the, realistically speaking, that in the short term, we can move towards more holistic deals even in bilateral relationships. Whereas I mean, this even at the EU level, a growing sense that if one wants to make progress in bilateral agreements with other countries, be it the US or be it others, it has to be more focused and targeted, because the sort of path dependency between, including environmental standards, including labor standards, including human rights, including economic growth, is very hard to construct packages where everybody benefits. It's become very difficult. And so at this point in time, I think ultimately, certainly for the European Union, it is in the interest that whatever progress is made bilaterally in an ad hoc way with other countries, it has a longer term goal of supporting the rules-based order and not disrupting it. And even this is going to be difficult to achieve, but it has to be, because I think it is in the interest of the European Union to have that as a long-term goal. But at the moment, I cannot say that it's in the interest of the United States, for instance. I mean, you mentioned the IRA, but also other measures. If you read The Economist, both the US and China are moving down the path of economic protectionism, and The Economist keeps on saying Europe should not go down that path. Whether it will or won't, this is to be seen. But I think, just looking at it from the point of view of multilateralism and rules-based order, it is in the interest of the EU to have, at least as a long-term goal or a medium-term goal, to support that. And I'm not entirely sure the US is there. And I think obviously, should Donald Trump win the elections, the United States will definitely not be there. So, yeah. That would be, but realistically speaking, I don't see that in the short term.
Okay, Charlie, and Dan too. I mean, everybody's talking about competitiveness on both sides of the Atlantic, although we probably have different things in mind when we talk about that. But, this question about China as a looming economic competitor, as a current one, but looming in the future as an even larger one, and strategically for the United States, can that be a driver of transatlantic cooperation, or is it likely to have the opposite effect? What do you think from Washington, Charlie? I'm looking over my shoulder.
I think it's hard to overstate how much of a sea change there has been politically on these questions. Barack Obama was really the last president that hailed from, the era in which Republicans and Democrats alike, mainly Republicans, but Democrats really starting in the 1990s, embraced kind of neoliberal free market trade liberalization agendas. And that ended with the contest between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where they both spoke ill of TPP and TTIP and trade liberalization. And right now, there's no place on the political spectrum for the reanimation of that agenda. And it's not just Trump. I mean, keep in mind that Biden has kept in place the tariffs. He just slapped 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. He has not done anything to breathe life into the WTO. And so this is a bipartisan move away from free trade. And I also think that it will to some extent work, but it also won't work. That is to say, are we going to address those big swaths of the American electorate that Dan referred to that feel like they've been left behind? Are they now all going to build either electric cars or solar panels? No. Yes, a few of them will, but it's not like this is going to remake the American economy. And so we really do need to have a broader conversation. What are working Americans going to do in 2035 to earn a living wage? And I don't think the answer is going to come from protectionism. It's going to come mainly from domestic investment, worker retraining, getting broadband access into rural areas, the leveling of the economy that requires a lot of policy tools short of protectionism. And we really haven't even begun to kind of have that conversation nationally. And I would sort of say the same thing about trade with China. It is the one place, Ian, where you can build bipartisanship, which is almost non-existent in this town. But the one place that you might be able to get a little bit of it is by talking about China, standing up to China, banning the export of semiconductors to China. But here too, it may buy us a little time, but it's not the solution. And so there is a conversation to be had here about, the economic prosperity of our societies in the digital era. We haven't started that conversation.
Yeah, would you agree with that? I mean, I see you nodding, but I mean, that doesn't always indicate agreement.
Well, I totally agree that China is one of the few areas in the U.S. where there is bipartisan agreement. There's almost each side is trying to outdo each other on bashing China. I think just one aside, I want to remind everyone, Donald Trump was quite outspoken in his, America first, protectionism. But let's remember that TTIP died in Europe before he was elected. That in Hamburg, the arguably the home of free trade, in the Hanseatic League, people were protesting against TTIP. In Britain, they were protesting against chlorinated chicken. So it was on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think with China, it's something we may want to come back to. But to borrow a phrase from dyed-in-the-wool conspiracy theorists, it's all connected. That there are concerns about the economy and there are concerns about security, and increasingly they are linked because an electric car is rolling software, right? So whoever makes that car is controlling, can stop you from driving somewhere. The solar panels have software linked to them, just like cell phones, everything else. So all of this is networked in ways that, this is one of the concerns that, if we're in a conflict with China, that China can flip a switch and all of our infrastructure turns off. So there are national security issues in basically consumer products in the way there were not when General Electric was making toasters, and that's significant. But at the same time, there's a trade-off against consumer well-being, because how many people will say, I will spend 4 to 10 times as much to buy the solar panel made by those people Charlie was just talking about in the upper Midwest or in Dunkirk, so that they don't come from Shenzhen.
Yeah. And here they've reached a price point where people are buying them to make fencing out of them at the moment. And so, it tells you something about the economies of these things. You mentioned it being about economy and it being about security, but it's also about people. And actually, there's a summit, a kind of impromptu one going on in this town today, right? Actually, probably as we speak, where some of these issues about leadership choices for the European institutions are being made. And, I think it's fair to say, I'd be interested if you all agree, that despite all of these differences that we've had over IRA and other things, that there has been an extraordinary sort of convergence, just as a matter of personality, relationships between von der Leyen and Biden, the fact that the Biden administration has taken the EU seriously as an interlocutor, which wasn't always true with Democratic administrations either. It certainly wasn't true for Trump. The people actually matter. Choice for High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, all of these things at a time of war in Europe. We don't know what's going to happen there, but we have some inkling. How do you all read that, the sort of personal equation here? I'll save for later the question of what happens if Trump is elected again, but even assuming the current equation.
No, it's interesting that you asked that. So we organized an event last week we had Javier Solana and Federica Mogherini, the two high reps, and so much was about how individuals get along, and in the European Union context, how important it is that the leaders actually have a united front and a single story to relate to audiences. And the chemistry between von der Leyen and Biden, but also the people working in the administrations has been critical. And I think we really could not have expected the EU to pull itself together to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine without that chemistry working, because so much, especially at the beginning, came from Washington. I mean, Washington provided the leadership to unite Europeans together on the strategy. So that certainly is very important. And I think we've also seen the limits of, beyond, the headlines and the gossip over, the sofa gate, et cetera, but actually it does matter if leaders don't get along. Ditto, I think, going back to France and Germany, the lack of chemistry between the French president and the German chancellor has also been observed. Now, with the European Parliament election results, the fact that they're going to be snap elections in France, and the fact that the coalition government has basically lost with the electorate, we're actually going to have a leadership vacuum coming from the two most important EU member states. And so, it is a big question mark. Who's going to be leading Europe? The story that we haven't been talking about very much has been how election results have gone in other countries, perhaps more peripheral in a geographical sense, but they have been governments have been confirmed in their, for instance, in Poland, the government has been its line of action has been confirmed in the elections. In other countries, the radical right has not done quite as well as in some closer to the centre. So there is a little bit of a story more on the periphery, but is that going to be enough to provide leadership? I don't know, which means that we go back to the decisions that will be made maybe this evening to confirm von der Leyen for another term, and for the next president of the European Council, and for the High Representative. I mean, that's what the newspapers are saying today. That team will actually be really important in moving the needle forward in the EU. How they're going to, if it's Biden again, I think the chemistry is already there. If it's going to be Trump, then we're going to have a different story, but that is going to be a different story.
Dan, what do you think? You're surely reporting on this too, like everyone else.
Yeah. But I want to second something Rosa said about US-EU relations. So the Trade and Technology Council was this very wonky panel put together to look at things like rules for AI and industrial standards, and there's nothing more wonky than industrial standards. But when it became clear that Russia might invade Ukraine, those same people were the ones who were involved in preparing sanctions. And people on both sides told us that it was thanks to the conversations in the TTC that they knew each other, they knew who to call, and they had a working relationship that enormously accelerated and facilitated the cooperation on sanctions. So from sort of November 2021 to late February 2022, you had just this flood of work done and preparation, so that within a week of the invasion, both sides in concert in a really unprecedented way rolled out sanctions and other measures that one can only imagine took Putin by surprise. And as you say, Rosa, that was really the result of relations. And I think similarly, under the Trump administration, one of the things, Trump, whatever his politics, didn't expect to win. And when he came in, he didn't have a team, and it took a long time, and people in Europe didn't know who to call, didn't know who to work with. So those are kind of two polar opposite examples of how the people really do matter. And I mean, it seems, say, with the summit tonight, that Europe, for all its issues, politicians from different ends of the political spectrum seem to think, von der Leyen, in a difficult situation, seems to have done pretty well, and let's stick with a winner rather than rolling the dice with someone new and untested.
Right. I sense NATO is doing that too, probably with Rutte, if that's it. Charlie, how does that look from Washington? The personality thing, the chemistry, leaders, but also in the institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think personality-wise, we're in pretty good shape here. I mean, Macron and Schultz don't seem to be bosom buddies, but in general, there's an enormous amount of consultation, really going back to the months before Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S. government and its European partners have just been latched at the hip, and the conversations come quite easily. Two concerns, I guess. One would be to pick up on Rosa's comment about political weakness in France and Germany. We don't know what'll happen in these snap elections in France. I'm a bit befuddled as to why he called those elections, Macron, but it's completely conceivable that he could end up with a government in the National Assembly controlled by National Rally. And then in Germany, the coalition was already very weak before the parliament elections, and now it's going to be even weaker. Biden, even if he wins, is probably going to lose the Senate. We don't know whether he's going to be able to win the House. But so we're just looking at weak and divided governments. The other thing I would say that worries me a bit, Ian, on this personality front is the kind of secular ongoing decline of civility. A few years ago, again, sort of singing Germany's praises, Germany seemed to be kind of above the line when it came to the kind of nasty, venomous politics that have infected the United States and some European countries. Having just been in Berlin, it's not that way anymore. People were speaking about each other across partisan lines with the same kind of anger that you hear in the United States. And so I do worry that as part of the hollowing out of our political centers and the loss of ideological moderation, we're just kind of seeing a steady erosion in political civility. And that's worrying.
Okay. As promised, I'd just like to go to all of you here for comments, questions. No need to disguise the comments as questions, although questions are more than welcome. And also, of course, online, the Q&A function works. So do just catch my eye, tell us who you are and where you're from, and that would be super. I know there are a lot of lively people in this audience because I know some of them. So please. Yes, right there. Microphone is en route.
I'm Monika Munstefernik. I'm an ancient of the College of Europe, very old ancient. I'm working for the European Parliament, relations with national parliaments. We are following a bit what's going on across the Atlantic because you have the antenna there, as you may know. So question is, what do you think about the NATO enlargement? Because we heard now Putin saying that the eventual end of the war would be, of course, conditioned by total no of Ukraine to NATO. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I actually, let me start with that one while you're all thinking of additional things to ask about. Thoughts on NATO enlargement in particular? I think we're thinking of Ukraine here. Charlie, go ahead. I know you have views about this.
I'm a bit of a naysayer on this. I know that we've had a written commitment coming out of the 2008 Bucharest summit to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And even though at the July summit here in Washington, it's pretty clear that there will not be a move to issue an invitation, they're talking about the summit, the bilateral security arrangements as being a bridge to NATO membership. I think that would be a mistake. The fact that we are not now fighting for Ukraine alongside Ukrainian soldiers is in some ways an indication of a judgment, a tough, cold-hearted judgment that we're not prepared to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. It's not readily apparent to me why we would then issue an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine that would obligate us to go to war with Russia if Russia attacked Ukraine. And we don't want to be in a position where we grant an Article 5 to Ukraine, Russia launches a drone on Kyiv, and either we go to World War III or we do nothing and then NATO starts to unravel. And the final thing I'd say is I am not unsympathetic with Russian concerns about the arrival of NATO in Ukraine. The United States spent most of its 19th century and the 20th century pushing other major powers out of its neighborhood. That's what great powers do. I understand why Russia does not want NATO parked on the other side of its 1,000-mile border with Ukraine. That doesn't mean I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine was justified. I just think we need to be more sensitive as to what we're doing when it comes to what we consider a moral admission of Ukraine. How does that look to the other side?
How does it look to you here?
I mean, I see all of Charlie's points. There's no doubt about that, especially in the context of hostilities, which is the current context. I do think there's one thing, and that is that the path to EU membership from an EU perspective, and looking at it from the point of view of what would be the EU interest, if Ukraine were to join the European Union, it would be in the EU's interest that Ukraine also joins NATO because of the security implication. So the EU has its own, version of an Article 5. And I just don't see that the European Union would be willing to offer those types of security guarantees without NATO coverage, if you see what I mean. Does this mean that this inevitably leads to Ukraine joining NATO? Maybe not, but then the bilateral security guarantees that various countries would have to give Ukraine would become important. So if the sort of logic in the US is, well, let's make sure that Ukraine can have a credible path of accession to the European Union as a substitute for NATO, it's just not going to work because it won't be in the interest of the EU. And that's something I think that the sort of hasn't really been the circle hasn't been squared on this front. in the
Yeah.
transatlantic conversation.
Interesting on that. No former Soviet bloc country joined the EU without first being a member of NATO. A couple of things. One, whatever Ukraine's membership is, assuming it holds its territory and isn't completely taken over by Russia, it will probably end the war among the most NATO standard countries in the world, because NATO is putting so much in there to train and structure Ukraine. So their military will probably be better integrated into NATO than many NATO countries. But I think, aside from, the comments we've heard, another factor is if you look at Hungary, now Slovakia, Poland over the past few years, I think in Washington, there is a feeling that maybe, the US was a little too cavalier in expanding NATO, not even for the impact on Russia, because at the time, Russia was flat on its back and didn't seem like a threat, but just in assessing the readiness of the countries and their democratic bona fides and stability, because NATO and you asked me here to talk about the economy, but I spend most of my time these days out at NATO, and I was there last week at the defense ministers meeting. The EU and many other organizations, the World Trade Organization, were based on good faith, and the rules, were founded on an assumption that everyone was more or less similar and had a similar, belief in the rule of law. That almost like saying we breathe air, that it wasn't a matter of discussion. And then we had these countries that for a while looked like, sort of they were at the children's table and could be ignored. Maybe they made a little noise. But over recent years, they've created problems for the original, organizers, and the rules are not at all ready for that. I mean, you look at the rules of the EU, you can't kick anybody out. You can barely discipline them. There is no way to kick someone out of NATO. It simply is not in the founding documents. So I think there's a feeling of like, and remember, Ukraine was a deeply corrupt, problem-ridden country for, basically, since the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think, whatever, putting Putin aside, Ukraine itself and some of these issues go through the minds of people in Washington, because there is institutional memory of the expansion in the 90s and the 2000s.
Right. I mean, we mentioned earlier the decline of civility, but there's also an increasing degree of ruthlessness at the geopolitical level and on trade and on other things that wasn't reckoned for in that period. It's one thing to talk about NATO enlargement when you don't have a war in Europe, or EU enlargement when you don't have a war in Europe. And countries were, many of them, more willing to take on, extend a nuclear umbrella than a free trade agreement with certain countries at the time. But we're in a different world. Aha! All right. I knew this would work. Wow. Okay. Let me go maybe right here in the front, and then we will go around, and perhaps I'll take a couple at a time, and I'll take notes. So
thank you. I actually have two questions.
Tell us who you are and where you're from.
I hope this is on. Yes.
It is. It is.
So my name's Antonia Wunderlich. I'm one of the students at the College of Europe. And I wanted to get back to what you were saying about the TTC and ask how likely you think it is that the TTC will continue under Trump, but also the likelihood of it continuing in its current shape and form if Biden is reelected. Because I know you mentioned some of the positive outcomes of the TTC, but in general, there has also been a lot of discussion about its potential flaws and drawbacks. And then my second question is about the upcoming elections in the UK and how a change in government in the UK might also impact transatlantic relations.
Okay, let's take another one. Maybe just right back there. That would be great.
Hello, my name is Jimena Gonzalez. I work at Freshfields, but I'm also a college alumna. I have a question regarding the Enrico Letta's report on the single market. Do you have any views on this? And also, we are now expecting, I heard, 200 to 400 pages Draghi report on competitiveness, where I think transatlantic relations will be featured. Do you have any comments also on data flows, or do you have any expectations on that report? Do you think it will have an impact on transatlantic relations? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe let me take one more, and then we'll come back to our group here. Just right there. We're going to have another round, so not to worry. It's coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Adam Bernardo-Pamen. I'm currently I'm still a student at the College of Europe, and I'm working at the council. I had one comment and then a question. My comment was more on the borders with Russia. Speaking about not having a big border now with Russia for NATO, there was always been the one with Kaliningrad, notably, and there's also now the bigger one with Finland and the 1,400 kilometers. But my question was more pertaining to going to the other side of the world, but China. There were some questions in the past few months about how the US would abandon Ukraine if it was something to happen with Taiwan, sorry, my bad. But the question I would have would be, how do you vision transatlantic differences pertaining to Taiwan and to China if a conflict were to emerge in the upcoming years?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me come back to our panel to address some of these. We have a question about the TTC, UK, Valletta and Draghi reports, and not least China, Taiwan, South China Sea, leaving Europe, all that stuff.
Okay.
Pick and choose, Rosa, as you like.
Well, on UK elections, I mean, the UK will remain a transatlanticist country, regardless of who's going to win the elections. The UK cannot leave that relationship. It's too important, and I think it's already preparing. The Foreign Office, etc. They're preparing for both outcomes, and as are many European governments as well. I mean, they're going to Washington, they're going to Congress, they're talking to the Republicans, they're talking to the Democrats, they're going to the Heritage Foundation. They're trying to figure out that this is happening at the level of national governments. So I would, so that would be my short answer on the UK. The Letta report, the Draghi report, I mean, I think it's still to be, if there's going to be continuity in terms of the political agenda for the EU for the next 5 years, then I think we'll see some picking and choosing on the Letta report, and the Letta report allows that because there's a bit of something for everyone there. But I think the big question for Europeans generally is whether there is a commitment to scale up the single market and to navigate the various dilemmas and challenges that entails. I mean, one thing, for instance, that came out in the responses to the Letta report is that the small member states were pushing back more than the large member states. Why? Because of the redistribution of, investment in terms of finance and who benefits from it. And smaller member states are worried that they're not going to get their bit of the pie. And I would say probably with the Draghi report, we're going to see similar things. It has to be said, and I think I mentioned that at the beginning, the US economic recovery is far better than the European. Europeans are lagging behind on all sorts of indicators: competitiveness, innovation, productivity. So really, this is going to be a big battle for the next leadership of the EU. And I think, how they're going to go about it is actually still not clear, especially if you have, the radical right so prominent, not so much in the European Parliament, but in the European Council. Are these parties, which are now in government in 7 countries, could be 8 soon, could be 9 in after the Austrian elections, are they willing to trust the European Commission with greater executive powers and oversight on the state of the economy to move forward in upgrading European economy? Are they willing to invest on enlargement, which could play a big role in upscaling the European economy, including, a sort of digitally advanced country such as Ukraine? Are they willing to do that for that end? And I have a big question mark on that. On China, I mean, Taiwan, if that's there's been quite a few sort of gaming scenarios. I think the bottom line is Europeans are going to focus on Ukraine, and at the moment there is a political commitment to do so, but would not have significant bandwidth to contribute militarily, but they can contribute in other ways, economically, etc. But I do also think this is something that perhaps we haven't said enough, is that whereas there's bipartisan consensus in the United States over China, I think in Europe, the risk of China is not assessed in the same way. It's not seen as an existential threat. It is seen as a massive problem to be managed. De-risking was the sort of political solution that worked well for the European Commission, and the US took that on board. But it does mean that you're not going to see the EU slap 100% tariffs, but slightly more nuanced policies and responses, and that the EU will continue to want to talk with China on certain issues, for instance, climate-related issues. So there's likely to be a bit of divergence there, which, if there is a friendly and sympathetic government in the United States, it can tolerate the diversity and we can talk about it, sort of thing. But if there isn't, that could have negative consequences for the EU.
Okay, Dan, Charlie, if you'd like to pick up on any of these, quite briefly, if you could, because I'd like to squeeze in another round. So please.
Maybe quickly on the TTC. I think that if Trump wins, I think it's doomed. I just don't see, based on the track record, let's just assume that. If Biden wins, it may change a bit, but I think it will stay, because I think, it's not sexy. It wasn't designed to have deliverables like some shiny new thing every quarter. It's very wonky, deliberately, and I think both sides just like what it gives them. So it may never be the flavor of the moment, but it will last. I think my thought on the Letta and the Draghi reports. There's already a laundry list of things Europe needs to be doing. I mean, the Capital Markets Union is celebrating 13 years of not being born. There's a to-do list. Some of it just needs to get done, and no number of reports is going to make them happen. And just quickly on Taiwan, I think part of the reason the U.S. has been pushing Europe to step up more on defense spending and on helping Ukraine is precisely that. The U.S. cannot be, running the day-to-day operations of Ukraine if there's a threat on the other side of the world. I mean, the days when the U.S. military was, as in the past, designed to fight 2.5 wars are long gone.
All right, Charlie?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. One is, I do think that one of the most important conversations to be had across the Atlantic is technology, is data flows, because I think that what we're seeing here is real regulatory divergence, where the Europeans are passing significant legislation when it comes to data. They're proceeding with antitrust. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think the United States Congress has passed a single piece of legislation dealing with high tech, with regulation, with social media, with AI. And I think this is an issue where there's going to get more and more urgency. And then on Taiwan, I would, if you said, on what issue are the US and Europe most likely to diverge on a geopolitical front over the coming decade, I would say it's China, where I agree with Rosa that here in the United States, it's the North Star. It is what you go after if you want to run for office. And so I can see a real head of steam building that for the Europeans looks too much like decoupling and not de-risking. And I think you could see real tension over that. And then on Taiwan, Europe does not have a lot of geopolitical skin in the game in the Indo-Pacific, and as a consequence, I don't think you would see much European involvement were there to be some significant military contingency. So I think Ukraine, there's a lot of solidarity and unity of purpose. I don't see that extending to China.
Okay, I think we have time for, well, a couple more. We do need to get people, well, to their reception at 6, but an express round. So let me go right in the front here if I could, and then, because you've been very patient. And here, right here. Yep. Please, and then.
Yeah,
then
thank you
we'll
so
go
much to everybody for being here. It's been great to hear from you, and thank you to Professor Lesser for having us here.
And introduce yourself.
Amazing. My name is Benjamin. I'm one of Professor Lesser's students. I'm French and American, which does mean I get to vote in 3 elections in the space of under 6 months, which is very fun. But I know we've talked a lot about the political risks of that various political currents have posed to the Transatlantic Alliance. But what about the economic risks? I was on both the United States and the EU, and Canada as well. I think we tend to forget them. The relationship has been underpinned by economic trade, as you mentioned. There's the 7 trillion, but both in the U.S., the IRA, and perhaps in the EU less visibly, with things like the DSA and DMA, which are regulatory instruments, but they're used to target. They're used against American companies and things like the FDI Screening Act. Do you see an economic risk that would undermine the Transatlantic Alliance? Is that something you would perceive as a risk going forward?
Okay, and just thank you. Just back there. Sorry to make you run around a bit, but
Also here.
Yep.
Lots of questions.
Oh, okay.
And
Right.
there.
So good afternoon. Thank you for having us. My name is Katja. I was a former Mata student. I graduated from Flickr last year. And so my question is a little bit more specialized in internal, domestic US politics. And I presume Dan was the one who mentioned about the cabinet of the former President Donald Trump last term that was a little bit new. So, I mean, unprepared. We had no contact whatsoever with anyone. But then this year, or for this year's election, should he win, the scenario will be totally different. I mean, predictably, his cabinet will be more prepared than his last term, and eventually we will have more connections. But and my point is, so we have been revolving about, or the narrative is that his next term, if he wins, will be completely damaging the transatlantic relations. So I would like to hear your intake about him being a little bit more toned down by his cabinet. So, I mean, this is a little bit the conversation that has been going on in the US, at least, that should he win, at least his cabinet will be a little bit more instrumental to calming him down and actually have a profound impact on the good transatlantic affairs and not into the bad scenario. So I would like to hear your intake of this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an optimistic question.
So there's one there.
But we'll have a response.
And
let's maybe over here, we've got a few people. Very quickly, if we could. Just in the front-ish. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elise. I'm a current Mata student as well. Thank you very much for your perspective on the year that has started and that is to be finished with the US elections. I wanted to come back on something you mentioned regarding the cooperation on the sanctions on Russia. We've heard some discussions about what to do with the frozen assets that have been sanctioned and taken since the start of the war. Do you see any potential cooperation on using the frozen assets to finance the war in Ukraine from a transatlantic cooperation and general framework on how to do that? And would there be a political will across the Atlantic to do so?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious of our time, and we did have one question online, at least. Or at least I have time to pick one. It's from Julia Perrier, actually, who was asking, how would the transatlantic partners deal with Hungary, given all we know about Hungary? So let me perhaps come back to you for a last round, in fact. So if there's anything else you want to add, and maybe this time, Charlie, we start with you.
Yeah, I'll just take a quick whack at the Trump question. I think the view here in Washington is that no, he will not form a cabinet that looks like the cabinet in Trump 1.0. There will not be what you might call adults in the room. And at least judging by the various people that he has in his orbit now and looking at some of the documents that are coming out of Heritage and another think tank, they are not without hard edges. Nobody knows what Trump 2.0 would be like. My best guess is that the most grievous damage will be here in the United States. I fear what will happen to the rule of law. I fear what will happen to political cleavages. I think the chances of violence in and around the election are high. And in some ways, I mean, he'll do damage abroad. And I think the biggest damage that he'll do is simply the symbolism of the American electorate reinstalling somebody who's a convicted felon who tried to overturn a democratic election. I mean, that mere fact cannot have huge impacts. But I actually don't think he's going to do really crazy stuff like pull out of NATO, in part because, he always asks, what's in it for me? And what's in it for Trump pulling out of NATO at a time when Russia is pounding Ukraine? Not much. And so the world out there constrains whoever the American president is. There isn't a lot of geopolitical slack right now. I would not say the same thing about the domestic front, where I fear that American democracy may be permanently impaired by a second Trump term.
Charlie, thank you very much. Dan.
Quickly on the question about economic risk, yes, there is. Risk is enormous, potentially, because one of the few areas where the European Union, where the European Commission has real power is trade. And in the sort of war rooms preparing for a Trump administration, people are thinking about how could we respond? We saw what Trump did on trade the first time around. So there is the potential of, probably sleepwalking is the wrong word because it would be very conscious, but not wanting to, but escalating into a trade war that has enormous spillover and impact, where it would lead, impossible to say again, because the trade by itself is a fraction of the total economic relationship, but the damage could be significant. I think on the Russian assets, I think already we're seeing it. Look at the G7 last week. There was alignment. It's hard because, among other things, just the fact that the EU has to renew sanctions every 6 months. There's concern about Hungary. There are complexities like that, but the intention, at least as of now, is there. And I think to the question online, I would imagine that people will continue doing what they're trying to do now is either ignore or work around or jump over Hungary or other countries that get in the way, and they will continue trying to throw up bigger barriers to advance their own agendas, which is what seems to be what's happening.
Rosa, last word, and perhaps your thought on the Hungary question as well.
Yeah, let me also just add on. I agree with Dan. The cooperation on sanctions will continue. I think the big question mark over Ukraine is what if Donald Trump wins the elections and decides to reach a peace deal with Putin? I think that is the big question, right? But it's it depends on Trump and how he feels on that day when he wakes up and decides that maybe this is something that needs to be done. On Hungary, I think there has been transatlantic cooperation on Hungary, at least inside NATO, but we'll never really know about it because what is it? It's that phone call to Budapest, right? That maybe one of the NATO countries does. So we won't really know about it. But I think the bottom line is that actually there isn't a strategy on how to deal with Hungary or other Hungaries, because it's not always, Hungary isn't always alone. And there isn't one. There isn't one in the European Union. I think we really are seeing the limits of it. And I don't think it's going to get any easier because the more Hungary gets what it wants, the more it encourages other countries from behaving in the same way. So we've really seen in the EU a sort of fraying of the sort of spirit of cooperation and consensus building that is required to do foreign policy. And I wonder NATO how, and I also wonder how much, leaders and decision makers meet in the corridors and not in the main rooms, because there is also an issue of, foreign external actors sitting at the table of decision making on very critical issues such as sanctions. Yeah.
Rosa, thank you. Dan, Charlie, thank you very much. This was really, I mean, I hope you'll agree that on a day of a rather newsworthy summit in Brussels, and thank you, Dan, for taking the time to escape from that. Well, all of you. This was really a wonderful conversation, and it started and ended in different ways on this question of people in the transatlantic relationship. And it's great to have a room full of people interested in the transatlantic relationship, and a new generation of people interested in the transatlantic relationship, and that's really terrific and what we were trying to do. Allow me, just before we end, a couple of words of thanks, if I could. First of all, to Microsoft and ESSA and to your team here, we're really delighted to be able to have this cooperation, but also to be hosted here. So thank you so much for that. I noticed Professor Michelle Chang arrived. I know you had something else to do, but I just wanted to acknowledge you because you're really leading the MATA program between these two universities, and it's great to work with you as always. Thank you so much for this. The Alumni Association of the College of Europe, we're really delighted to have that cooperation and your role in bringing people to us today. So thank you for that on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, because that was part of the purpose. And finally, and not least, my colleague Pablo Villatoro Jarillo, who really put this thing together. Thank you, Pablo. These things do not happen by accident, and so we look forward to seeing all of you again in the future. We'll think up new ways to engage all of you, and do join us for the reception outside. So thank you.